Hello, viewers. You're watching Crux of the Matter, a very special edition today. Ancient China, Greece, Persia, Rome, Egypt, the world exalts their contribution to our advancement, to our collective advancement. Now, a new treatise reveals that ancient India had a transformative effect on the ancient world right up until 1000 CE, and perhaps the legacy has lived on. Award-winning historian William Dalrymple, who has a staggeringly wide-angle view of Indian history that he has prolifically and exactingly turned into one bestseller after another, says ancient India was, and to quote him, the forgotten heart of the ancient world, unquote. William Dalrymple, thank you for speaking to me on your latest historical treatise, this masterpiece.
Great pleasure. And I should congratulate you on this extraordinary studio. I've never been on a sort of dance floor while being on television.
It's quite the disco, isn't it?
You and John Travolta could happily set up shop here.
We're going to dance through a lot of history then tonight. Wonderful having you. And I know it's been a long tour. You've come down from Kasoli and so on and so forth.
This is barely the beginning. Next week I'm setting off to Southeast Asia and Australia to take this book around the furthest reaches of the Indosphere.
And you've already done UK.
Done the UK.
Where the Indosphere does reach and had reached.
Sadly, the Indosphere is not as well known in the UK as it should be, is it?
Well, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and their grasp of history is quite shaky on quite a few things. But The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, a brilliant book. How did you come to it? You're the chronicler of British and, to an extent, Mughal India. What drew you to write about the Indic civilization? You know, there's so much talk right now about the Indic world.
Well, there's lots of different answers to that. I think probably one of the most honest answers would be that my family were complaining that I'd written the same book 4 times in a row with my 4 East India Company quartet books, are all very much pitched in the same area, the East India Company and the late Mughal Empire. To me, they appear very different books. My family was very keen that once we'd packaged up all 4 into a box set, that I'd do something completely different and bring something slightly more interesting to the dinner table as far as they were concerned. So what I did was I went back to what was always my first and oldest interest, which was the ancient world. When I was a kid growing up in a remote part of Scotland, I begged and pleaded my parents to take me to London for the very first time to see the Tutankhamun exhibition at the British Museum when I was aged about 7, I think. And I remember, actually, the thing that made as much of an impression as the Tutankhamun show was coming out and seeing Hare Krishna people dancing around London, which was, I'd never seen anything like that in Scotland.
And they didn't need a disco floor like
that. They would do very well here. Exactly. And all my teenage summer holidays was spent digging on archaeological excavations, and I remember writing an essay in my primary school. What do you want to be when you grow up? And my answer was an author and an archaeologist. And so I haven't changed much in all that time. But when I came to India, it was still very much in that phase of my life. And so the first places I went off to see were Ajanta and Ellora, Sanchi, and Mahabalipuram. This is 1984 as an 18-year-old, rather thinner and with rather more hair than I have now. And I think my teenage self would be slightly disappointed in that its middle-age avatar ended up writing about the 18th and 19th centuries, which was an area which had no appeal to me at all as a child. And it was my father's time. He used to take us around National Trust grand country houses, and I used to scream and say, no, please, I want to go and see a stone circle. So for me, this is the stuff that I've always loved, but since university have not been at all an expert about it. I've written lots of scholarly articles on the art history of Buddhism and so on in the New York Review of Books over the last 40 years, and there's a long chain of articles which were used for this book, but I've never written on a book scale before. And it was into this that I dived during lockdown, when we were all locked up with our houses, with just our resources of our libraries to.
So it did do someone good.
So it did me a lot of good. Funny enough, a lot of parents my age rather enjoyed lockdown because their children were locked up with them and couldn't go out and desert them and do more interesting things. So I had a very nice lockdown. And by the time that lockdown was over, the basic architecture of this book was pretty well complete, which is 3 main sections, really. First of all, the story of how Buddhism, which was ancient India's, in a sense, most successful export, in that it immediately took off in all directions. Oh. Burma, Sri Lanka, across to China, Korea, Japan, eventually getting as far as Mongolia and Siberia. That's the first third of the book. The second third is specifically about the Hinduization and Sanskritization of Southeast Asia, which is the most extraordinary story, how this entire chunk of the world, which is quite a long way from India. I mean, Cambodia is about 4,000 miles away from here, ended up renaming the landscape in such a way that you have a new Kurukshetra in Laos, you've got a new Ayodhya just outside Bangkok, while the main river that runs through the middle is the Mekong, which is just the Khmerization of Ma Ganga. It's the same word.
Yes.
And it's an extraordinary story, and one that even here in India, I think, is not as well known as you'd expect. And when you go to Angkor Wat, which is the largest Hindu temple in the world.
Temple, yeah.
No, a Vaishnav temple.
Vaishnav temple, yes. Yeah.
The Khmers built mainly Shaivite shrines, and Angkor Wat is unusual in being a Vaishnav shrine.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's there you walk around and you see pictures of the Battle of Kurukshetra or the War of Lanka, stories told in these parts, but they're there on the walls of Angkor Wat in the middle of Cambodia. And then the final part of the story, again, is a story that people here know fairly well, but don't know some of the details of. The story of how Indian numbers and mathematics and astronomy and astrology and Indian science passed first to the Arab world, which it did through the intermediary of a group of formerly Buddhist abbots from Afghanistan who were Sanskrit literate and brought in copies of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta in the 770s. And then through the person of Al-Khwarizmi, it spread around the Arab world, and then it's taken from Algeria to Pisa by none other than Fibonacci. So there's all sorts of odd sort of people turning up in this story, and I've tried to keep it like my 18th century company books, very peopled. I like my history full of character and biography, yes. And that's how I see the world around me. I mean, I'm very intrigued by people's lives and
which you trace back to the writings of a medieval historian who was very colourful.
Yes, I mean, you're talking about Stephen Runciman?
Yes, that's right.
Stephen Runciman is a person little read in this country. He's a historian of Byzantium and the Crusades. Right. But he wrote a particular type of history, which from the period when I was at university, I knew this was what I wanted to do. And he's a man of enormous learning of every language, from all the different sort of Greek, Latin, Persian, Armenian, Turkish, all the obvious languages, but a whole variety of sort of strange sort of Serbo-Croats and Bulgars and all sorts of other tongues. But he would bring all the primary sources together and yet write books that were as full of character and incident as any novel. And there's sometimes, I think, an impression in this country that for history to be done properly, it has to be incredibly boring, which is not at all an idea I subscribe to. I think your scholarship should show in your footnotes and in your accuracy and in your rigorous use of sources.
And the people who've reviewed the book say that it is very well written because you are a master of turn of phrase and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
But let me ask you this, because there'll probably be already a whispering campaign. You're sitting with a conservative editor, a journalist who has been cancelled, and you've written on a subject which preoccupies the minds of one set of Indians, and certainly non-Marxists. I'm sure they're saying that this is William Dalrymple riding the crest of the new Hindutva wave, or are you just righting a wrong? I mean, I
I mean,
have
this
to
is
ask you this.
neither at all. I mean, there is this sort of odd view in India, which I enjoy just because it's sort of slightly baffling to me that if you write about the Mughals, you're somehow a Marxist. Why a Marxist would be particularly attracted to the most lavish dynasty that ever existed, I'm not entirely sure. The Mughals were certainly not Marxists. And equally, that if you have an interest in ancient India, particularly the Guptas, you must be a card-carrying RSS Prachatnik. Yeah. I'm neither. I'm a centrist, and I'm interested in both periods of history. And I think it's the job of the historian to try and bring his scholarship to bear on any period of history that he's interested in, with what he sees to be the truth. Now, people may disagree with that, which is fine, and I'm sure there are people on both the left and the right who would have written
So this is just a
completely
curious
different.
historian who wants to tell a story that perhaps hasn't been told in the manner that you think it should have been.
So
the
hang
word
on,
that you used.
to answer that, yes.
Yeah.
There are bits of this story that will be very familiar to an Indian audience. What I think has not been done at all, which is astonishing, for maybe 40 years since A.L. Basham wrote the wonderful The Wonder That Was India, in I think 1954, which
That's
is
right.
this great fat
Big fat
brick
tome.
that anyone
Yes, yeah.
either brought up here or anyone that comes here and wants to take an interest in Indian culture will always turn to.
Yes, you always use it as a bookend.
Or indeed a door stopper,
Yes.
throw it at younger brothers or whatever, or children. There's been a huge amount of scholarship on all aspects that I cover in this book, but I don't think anyone's brought it together into a single holistic whole. And to me, that's the whole point of this book, that the story of the spread of Buddhism is not, as it's usually told, part of the Silk Road, and maybe we can talk about.
Yes,
my views on
I'm
the
coming
Silk
to
Road.
that.
But just again,
yes.
this thing of different silos.
Yeah.
So Buddhism is seen as part somehow of the story of China, of the Silk Road, of somewhere outside of India. The story of Southeast Asia is normally told as part of the Sanskrit department of universities. It has a different room in the museum. Yeah. And the story of mathematics, as far as it's taught at all abroad, which it isn't really, to be honest. And going around Britain with this book over the last month, I was astonished how few people actually.
You must have left them wide-eyed.
Well, I mean, I'd say many lectures, even in places like Oxford and Cambridge, who's ever heard of Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta, and 3 people would put their hands up and they'd all be Indian.
Well, some would say that the British are complicit in sort of bearing that, but
which is a very interesting thing to talk about, and is part of the story too.
Yes, I'm going to ask you that because that's the second or third question that we're getting into. This was just a preliminary, but look,
just to pull that together. So it's the idea that this book brings together into a single story the diffusion of Indian ideas, things which are normally held separate. And so this isn't actually a book about India. This is a book of how Indian ideas left India and how they changed the world around it.
Right. So the Indosphere is what you sort of call this thing that was populated by the overwhelming cultural, religious ideas and this, that, the other,
which is
and
a very,
trade
very
and commodity.
tangible thing. In
So
which
so I have to ask you this because what is it really? And if it was so outsized as your book suggests, why haven't we heard of it till now?
So that is a completely fascinating exercise, because it isn't just that the Brits haven't heard of it. People in this country have not heard of it, and are not really aware of it. There is, I think, a very widespread awareness in this country that we have a great culture. We have a very ancient culture, that we have a culture which other people don't appreciate as much as it is. And that leads to sort of some often rather sort of eccentric WhatsApp uncle stuff, like the character in the, I don't know whether you know the Sanjeev Bhaskar Goodness Gracious Me sketch, where the uncle says Indian when he talks about Leonardo da Vinci or the royal family or whatever it is. And then there's a whole sort of WhatsAppy university world where people vaguely think that maybe there were atomic weapons in the Mahabharata or plastic surgery in the Vedas, and on it goes, flying machines in the Ramayana. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is to say that the actual, real, historical, factual story of ancient India is so extraordinary that there's no need for fantasy. There's no need for taking things in a sort of mystical way out of the world of hard fact and evidence. That the real story is astonishing and needs to be told. It needs to be told very clearly. And one of the things I've done is a quarter of this book our footnotes.
I saw that,
Because
yes.
partly because this is such contested territory, and people do want hard evidence for things, quite rightly.
Well, I put in 100 pages of footnotes in my book because the subject I was dealing with was,
Equally
controversial.
contentious.
And I just wanted no one to stab me in the back, so to speak. Yeah.
Exactly that.
So, yeah.
So it's pulling together all these different threads and telling a story about this extraordinary period, which begins really about 250 BC, when, in my view, Ashoka starts sending out his missionaries, his Dharma ministers. And we have an inscription in Kandahar, particular, which talks about the fact that he sent them as far as Cyrene, which is Libya. That's a long way from India in the ancient world. And we have also echoes of some of Ashoka's inscriptions in Greek inscriptions in Anatolia, implying that people are reading what he's writing over there. And we have evidence that his son Mahinda went to Sri Lanka and converted the Sri Lankans. Only 2 years ago, Mahinda's stupa was found on the hill of Rajagala in the central, wonderful mountain in the center of Sri Lanka, which I climbed up last Christmas. And there you see the Brahmi script of Mahinda, and it's one of the oldest stupas in the world.
So the Golden Road is really the pathway for this dissemination. What was it? Who traversed it? And what went up and down it?
So the Golden Road is in a way a counterblast against this very prominent idea of the Silk Road, which everyone assumes is a historical fact now, and also kind of, I think, assumes is something that's always been there and is there in ancient sources, but it's not. The Silk Road is an idea that was first coined in German in 1870 by a character called von Richthofen, who was Baron von Richthofen, was a German geographer. He wrote a book called Des Heidenstraßen, which is about, it just means the Silk Roads. Yeah. And it was in the background that he was trying to plan a colonial railway route from Berlin to Peking. And the idea first enters English in 1937, I think, with a character called Sven Hedin, who was a Swedish explorer and a Nazi sympathizer, incidentally, who wrote a book called The Silk Road, which first came out in the mid-30s. And by the 1980s, when I was a student, the idea was first circulating. My first book was following Marco Polo along this road. And there's no question that by the time of the Mongols kind of smashed a hole through the middle of Asia from China right through to the Mediterranean, destroying all the polities in between. And by that stage, Marco Polo really could, in the 13th century, set off from the Mediterranean and arrive 2 years later on the shores of the South China Sea with just one passport, having had no customs checks or borders on the way. But that was far from the case in the ancient world. In fact, there's no evidence that Rome and China had any clear idea of each other's existence. Not one single coin hoard Roman coin hoard has ever been found in China. But what we do have is huge numbers, vast numbers of Roman coins turning up, particularly in the South Indian coast, around Pondicherry, around Arikamedu, in Muziris, which is in Kerala, along that whole coast. Not a few, but tens of thousands of Roman coins, and have been turning up since the 18th century. And they turn up every year. Mary Beard, the classicist, told me that she thought there were more Roman coins in Indian museums than any other country outside the Roman Empire. And we have these descriptions of Strabo, who's another Roman geographer in the first century, going on a tour of Egypt with the Roman governor of Egypt. And he says, at Myos Hormuz, I saw a fleet of 250 vessels waiting for the winds to turn so that they could catch the winds in August back to India. 250 vessels is a vast rate. So while there's no evidence at all that Rome and China had any clear conception of each other's existence, Rome and India were intimate trading partners. Rome was India's leading trading partner and vice versa. And we have extraordinary figures now from papyri. We have extraordinary excavations taking place in Pattanam, Muziris in Kerala. A guy called P.J. Cherian, who's a great hero that needs a lot more support from the government. He's been
so I was going to ask you, because you've said that the Golden Road made India rich.
Absolutely.
And there is a reference to Pliny, and he says, to the sink of the world's most precious metals, unquote. very interesting phrase. Tell us a little bit about who Pliny was and why he said this, because he assumed that India was sucking the world's gold
So it's very
and
interesting.
enriching
It's very
itself.
interesting because we're very used to this idea of the East India Company, and I've written about it over 4 volumes, sucking the wealth of India into England. But here we have Pliny, who is a Roman naval commander. He's a completely recognizable type. You'd find Pliny today sitting in the Gymkhana Club, propping up the bar, ordering a double whiskey, and complaining about newfangled kids on their phones or the internet or something. And what he complains in his age, his equivalent of the internet or the mobile phone, is this terrible newfangled material called silk, which all the decadent women in Rome were wearing, and which showed all the contours of their body without any modesty whatsoever. And he also complains about this terrible black powder which is going around Rome. He's not talking about cocaine or any narcotics, but pepper, which was the kind of the newfangled. And these were highly expensive luxuries for Romans. And the other great thing, of course, was the Romans loved Indian gemstones. All the diamonds in the world came from India, as well as onyx and chalcedony and a whole variety, and particularly garnets. And there's a lovely story, which I tell in the book, that one of Nero's mistresses,
I was going to come to
Lola
that.
Paulina, was so proud of the fact that she had these gemstones covering her hair, her body, and her feet, that she apparently carried the receipts to parties in Rome to show anyone that was interested how much they cost.
Yes, I was sort of coming up with a phrase. I said a modern princess like Diana. It's the equivalent of her flaunting YSL.
Exactly.
Or a Coco Chanel. Now, so Brand India was worn with huge aplomb, wasn't it?
So, I mean, there's all sorts of things, little things we have to be a little bit careful. First of all, of course, there is no one country called India
Right.
at this period.
Yeah.
There is an area that is recognizably known as India. And, for example, when Alexander the Great turns up at Taxila, he talks to the Sadhus, and the Sadhus say India is bounded on the west by the Indus, on the east by the Ganges, and on the south by the sea. So there's a very clear conception of India as a geographical, a sacral, a cultural unit. But for almost all of its history, unlike China, it's fragmented. And the periods
Politically,
such as the age of Ashoka or the Guptas, when it's united, are the exceptions. But nonetheless, there's a clear understanding that this was a coherent region, which had a certain way of doing things. So, for example, when the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang turns up in the 670s, he talks about India being a wonderful holy region of 70 countries. So it was very fractured, and many of these kingdoms were very small. But there's an understanding they're all part of a unit called India.
Now, you've put a number to the riches that came into India and what the Roman Empire made out of India, the trade with India. Can you tell our viewers
Sure.
about this? Because this is quite fascinating.
So, first of all, one has to, again, be very careful about this, because although there are people like Angus Maddison who've come up with trade figures for many countries in the world right back into antiquity, you obviously don't have trade figures like you have today or economic statistics, and a lot of it is speculation. But what we do have for only the last 15 years is an extraordinary document which talks about this sort of thing, which is called the Muziris Papyrus. And this papyrus turned up probably from a place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, but it was on the market. It was probably illegally excavated, and it's now in Vienna. And what it is it's an extraordinary thing. It's a shipping invoice from the 1st century. Exactly what someone in the docks of Bombay will be producing at this moment, enumerating the things he's putting in a shipping container to send somewhere else. And this document, which is in Greek, so seems to have been written by the Greek recipient of this container, which is coming from Muziris in Kerala, has, in a sense, 3 columns. So he says what's in the container, how much each item costs, and then how much he's going to have to pay the Roman customs to get it into the Roman Empire. So for this one particular container, which had 2 tons of ivory, a whole lot of amphorae full of black pepper, and then some other little things like nard, which is an expensive perfume, a material used in perfume from the Himalayas, some silk, some cotton, another perfume product called malabathrum, and maybe some gemstones. In this one container, we know the exact price of each of these items. And particularly, the largest item was ivory, 2 tons of ivory. And we know the name of the ship, which is the Hemapelon. We know it was sailing, I think, AD 40. And what we don't know is whether it ever reached Alexandria, which is where it was heading. It probably did, but on the other hand, it could possibly have sunk. But what it tells us is the astonishing cost of all these Indian luxury products, particularly ivory and particularly pepper, which were going for a ridiculous markup. And so your Indian trading forebears were doing very nicely, nudging the price of these luxuries up. And it's clear that if the exporter successfully got this container on the Hemapelon all the way to Alexandria, he stood to become one of the richest men in Roman Egypt and be able to buy almost any estate in the country or a nice estate in central Tuscany with enough change to join the Senate. So this was no sort of poor man's sort of stab in the dark. This is a major racket which the Indians are up to. Yeah. And it's slightly like, like when today you go to Heathrow or something, you get stuck in duty free and you end up buying all that expensive whiskey that you then regret and lots of expensive Hermes perfumes that you feel almost guilty to spray on yourself. It's so costly. That's the kind of thing the Romans are importing. And the influence is going both ways. We recently found a triad of early Vaishnav gods turning up in an Isis temple in Berenike, which is the port that the Indian sailors were landing. An extraordinary Gandhara-style head of a Buddha, but in white marble. And in return, you get the Jews and the Christians arriving in Kerala at the same time. So the St. Thomas Christians, they claim, of course, that St. Thomas came to convert them. Whether or not that's specifically true, there were clearly early, we know for a fact that there were early Christians by the end of the 1st century, because Eusebius, the church historian, says that a whole load of Indians turn up in Alexandria asking for a bishop and some holy books. So it's going in both directions. And you see specifically Roman Egyptian products turning up in Mathura, south of here. There are various iconographies of Serapis, for example, that turn up in early Mathura sculpture. We also know that one of the first images of the Buddha as a human being, as opposed to 2 feet or a throne, which is how Buddhism originally showed the Buddha, his initial human form is probably based on Apollo. And all those Gandharan statues that you see in the Indian Museum and the National Museum here are based not on ancient Greek sculpture, but on contemporary Roman sculpture, which is being traded to offset the cost of these luxury products, which Indians are merrily exploiting at an enormous markup to Rome.
Well, look, viewers, he has put a number, and he's going to hold back, and I think you should read the book, and your eyes will pop out of your skulls. But
just to give you one figure,
okay,
which is a controversial figure and still under scholarly argument. But there's an argument going on at the moment, and articles passing backwards and forwards between rival groups of scholars about whether the customs take on all this was so huge at Myos Hormuz that they're now estimating that between 1/5 and 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget, all the money needed to build Roman roads, Hadrian's Wall, the Algerian frontier, the Rhine frontier, 1/3 of all that came from the customs take, 270
just the tax.
Million sestertii, the customs fee.
On the trade.
They took 1/3.
Wow. That's 33% of the Roman budget came just from this one golden road that went up to the Mediterranean. Okay. Look, never thought that Indians were seafaring. I mean, we've... you write of a Raja who went to Alexandria on sightseeing, of a parade of Indian women in Rome. These are magical nuggets of the extent to which the Indians were traveling.
On my way to your studio, I bumped into Sanjeev Sanyal in Chandigarh Airport, where we had a dosa together, and he's currently building a ship based on one of these. I think largely on an image in the Ajanta caves, but also based on various finds that have been made of shipwrecks.
Yes, he mentioned it once to me. Yeah,
and that's now nearly. He showed me photographs. It's nearly complete. The Indian Navy are doing this for him, and he's going to sail it to Oman. So know that your impression that Indians were not sailors is very mistaken.
Yeah.
There was, and the reason that Indians have always been successful sailors is something that Indians have no control over, which is the astonishingly beneficial meteorology of this land. Tibet, as we speak, is freezing over. I've just come from Kasauli, and you can see the first snows on the hilltops. In winter, cold winds rake into the Tibetan plateau, and in the spring, in the thaw, hot winds, warm winds blow out. And those sort of bellows every year, 6 months one way, 6 months the other, mean that the monsoon winds are incredibly predictable. And so if you're a sailor from India, you can, at any period of history, just put up a sail. Off you go, once you've learnt to ride the monsoon winds. And in 2 months, you can move from Kerala to Egypt. Then you have to wait a few months for the roads to reverse. Hence all these stories of Rajas having houses and mistresses in Alexandria. And they go and see the pyramids, or they go attend the circus, whatever they do, go shopping. And then they come back, and the winds blow them equally fast in the opposite direction, back to India from August onwards. So it's a very benign wind system, which has meant that Indians, far more than any other nation in the region, have the ability just to go and come back with great predictability throughout history. Which is why you've always had these great trading communities on the coast of Gujarat, in the coast of Kerala, and in the Bali Yatra from Konarak and all this sort of thing. And this I think, meteorology and climate forms a nation, and the fact that you have these wonderful trade winds, which they're the engine of the Golden Road, and the Golden Road in turn is the engine of Indian economic and cultural clout.
It's not just commodities and gold, but some epoch-defining ideas that that went up and down the Golden Road. Mathematics, Buddhism, other.
So the chronological order seems to be that the Buddhists were the first out the trap, if you like. And we've got early wooden images of the Buddha turning up in the Mekong Delta from the 4th century AD. We've got a new image of the Buddha turning up in the Red Sea coast, just from Berenike in the 2nd century AD. Hindus follow very quickly. And it may be that archaeology will show that they were there at the same time as the Buddhists. At the moment, we do have a slight precedence of Buddhist traders.
Well, you mentioned in your book that at that time the Vedic Hindus were sort of inward-looking, and they sort of weren't particularly outward-looking. They discouraged travel.
I don't say that. What I do say is that obviously the laws of Manu and the Puranas both talk about not crossing the Kalapani. Now, what seems to have happened is that very early on, the people found ways around that. And we have references to Brahmins turning up in Southeast Asia by means of yoga. In other words, they sort of apparate. But very soon what you see happening is that as you have a new Kurukshetra, a new Ayodhya, and the Mekong becoming Mar Ganga, with lingams and yonis sculpted into the riverbed at the source of the Mekong. Extraordinary when you go there and see it. When you, what happens is that Southeast Asia becomes peacefully, not by conquest, not by military might, not by the sword, but Southeast Asia becomes integrated into the conception of India. And it seems, we know from DNA evidence that large numbers of Brahmins of all communities, not just Brahmins or seafaring communities, but such as the Irulas on the edge of Tamil Nadu. But there's now quite detailed DNA studies of people turning up from India in significantly large numbers, that they actually altered the DNA of Southeast Asia between the 5th and the 12th centuries.
Also altered the science of the world.
Yeah.
This is this fascinating account. There's a whole chapter in your book devoted to math and the export of zero, and you're better at telling it. So,
well, I should say straight up that I am absolutely not a mathematician, but it has gone through many mathematicians, this text, before it went to print. So I think my clumsy maths has been ironed out by proper scholars. But yes, so again, this is quite an important point. I think sometimes when people conceive of the genius of ancient India, they see it very much as something happening in isolation, rishis sitting on a mountaintop. In reality, what you see in the Ajanta cave paintings and so on is that India is already an incredibly cosmopolitan country because it's so rich, because it's got 2 harvests a year, it's got all these gems, it's got pepper, it's got silk coming from China through its ports. Because of that, you have Parthians, Yavanas, Persians, all sorts, Ethiopians from Aksum and Dulis, all flocking to India by the 1st, 2nd century BC. And maths and science there is already a very remarkable Vedic science that's used to build and calculate Vedic sacrifices, and in order for them to be at the auspicious times with the moon and in the right phase and so on, there has to be a great deal of astronomy and calculation. But the golden age of Indian mathematics is actually slightly later, during the Gupta period. And what's clear is that it's not coming out of just India. The Indians are reading the latest math coming out of Persia, Babylonia, what they call the Yavana Sutras, which is Greece. And then they're taking it further. So you get in Aryabhatta hints that there's huge learning behind it over a whole range of different foreign disciplines, and then he takes it forward. So just like a great scholar today will master all the knowledge that is current and then take it the step forward that is the mark of a genius. That's what's happening in ancient India. It's not, a sort of hermetically sealed country which is in isolation doing its own thing brilliantly. It's getting in all that is known and doing it better. And that's quite an important distinction. So what you have is Aryabhatta, as I think every good patriotic Indian knows, comes up with the circumference of the Earth, the distance between the moon and the Earth, the pi, the fact that the Earth is spinning on its own axis. 100 years later, the work of Brahmagupta is probably written mainly in Bihar, of all places, near Pataliputra. Mm-hmm. Another guy, 100 years later, Brahmagupta, who's sitting again probably on Mount Abu in Rajasthan, he meditates on sunya, the absence, which is at the heart of Buddhist and Hindu thought, and comes up with a new definition of zero. Zero, again, has been around since Babylonian times as a placeholder, as an absence. But it's Brahmagupta that realizes that zero is a number with its own properties. For example, it's the number you get when you take a number, subtract a number from itself. And then he comes up with 30 or 40 rules that define zero. And this is what gives zero its incredible power. And it allows you to do place different tens, yes, hundreds, thousands, decimal system, and so on. And
placement math.
Yeah. And then it allows you also to express, once zero has been added as a number, it allows the 9 Indian numerals plus zero to express with great efficiency any number up to infinity, which is something we take for granted. We look at zero and don't think twice about it. We shrug. Yeah. It's there on our phones. We use it every minute. But someone has to come up with the definition, and that's Brahmagupta. He's drawing again on a lot of earlier stuff from India and elsewhere, but he takes it 5 steps forward. And this stuff is important to rulers because it impinges on Jyotisa, which in India is the science of both mathematics, astronomy, and astrology. To us, those are 3 very different things, but they're studied in India very much as one. And it was believed in India and elsewhere that once you understood the movement of the heavens and could predict eclipses and so on, you can understand the heavenly influences on human beings and therefore can predict the future. Not only auspicious dates like today, for when's a good day for a wedding, but actually how battles will turn out and so on. And so there's this extraordinary moment in 773 AD when this family of formerly Buddhist abbots from Afghanistan, who are now the viziers, hereditary viziers in Baghdad, but who come from a Sanskrit literate background, and they are, one of their members, Khalid ibn Barmak, had been to Srinagar and studied higher maths there. I mean, it's so extraordinary. We have all the details of this. Yes. There's a whole Arab book on the Barmakids which has survived in part in another book, and we have that. And in 773, a delegation comes from Sind over the Indus to Baghdad, bringing a book that the Arabs called the Great Sind Hind, but which seems to be a compilation of Aryabhatta and the 2 different works of Brahmagupta, his mathematical treatise written in his 20s, and a book on astronomy written later in life, probably in Ujjain, when he was running the astronomy center at Ujjain. And again, we have the details. So the Barmakids are these guys who are Sanskrit literate, who appreciate the profundity of Indian learning and are not outsiders to it. They're part of that tradition. And they bring in this book. They bring a variety of Indian sages to explain it, because Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta don't only write with extreme complexity, they write in poetry. And the next thing that happens is that this kid from a place called Khiva, which is now northern Uzbekistan, but which the Arabs call Khwarizmi, he turns up in Baghdad and he translates all this stuff with incredible clarity. He throws in a bit of Euclid from the Greeks, but a few other things, but it's basically Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And this becomes, it's so simple, it's so comprehensible, it's so easy for even a kid to understand, that this guy's work becomes the standard text. And he's al-Khwarizmi, and he writes this book called, it's got a snappy title, The Book of Completion and Balancing by Hindu Calculation. And everyone does we can't call it that, it's too long. So they call it Al-Jabr, which is the basis of our word algebra. And his name, Al-Khwarizmi, is the source of our word algorithm. This passes around the Arab world, and it's only 1200, which is a full 400 years later, that it finally reaches Europe. And the person who brings it is a kid from Pisa. He happened to be brought up in Algeria, where his father was a notary in the customs house. Again, customs being something that comes, a trading zone. And when he goes back home to Italy, he's learnt all this wonderful Arab mathematics just at the local school in Algeria, nothing very fancy. So he hasn't gone to Oxbridge or something, or Harvard, or the monastery of Nalanda. He's just learnt this locally, but it's streets ahead of what the Europeans have. And he goes back home, and they're still doing MCMV XV1 versus CCCVM, or whatever it is. And he said, look, guys, you've got to get your act together. So he writes the Liber Abaci, which is basically, again, Brahmagupta via Al-Khwarizmi. And he recognizes it as the modus Indorum, the Indian method. It's not
he gives them credit.
Yeah, he's not pretending that this is something he's come up with or the Arabs come up with.
Which is very noble of him.
Both Al-Khwarizmi and Fibonacci are completely clear that these are Indian inventions. I don't know what point they suddenly become Arabic numerals, but not when they're first translated. And this kid is Fibonacci. He's the great mathematical genius. And the Liber Abaci comes to the attention of the emperor, and he's called to court. And then there's a nice walk-on part for a Scotsman in the story, one of my compatriots, character called Michael Scott. And Michael Scott tells Fibonacci that he's written a book of genius, but it's still too theoretical. He says, "Look, pal, you've got to do a wee bit more of the straightforward stuff." So he tells him to add weights and measures, currency conversion, double accounting, and interest rates. And so the second edition of the Liber Abaci contains all the practical tricks that a merchant or a moneylender or a banker can use to increase their wealth. And this thing goes viral in Italy. It's the book that the Medici use for learning all their stuff. Later, it's picked up by the painter Piero della Francesca, who's not well known in India, but is, for those of us in Europe, he's considered the greatest of Renaissance painters. He writes 3 mathematical texts based on all this, and they are plagiarized by somebody called Luca Fra Caroli, who takes them to Milan, where he shares them with his flatmate. The flatmate is Leonardo da Vinci. So you have this wonderful relay race from Pataliputra to Mount Abu to Leonardo da Vinci.
To Milan. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And this is very well detailed in this book. It's absolutely, it's a riveting chapter or 2, actually. Now, let's come to China and this whole Indosphere. This is very fascinating because I was fascinated to read, apart from the fact that the Silk Road was not known till the German came along. But Buddhism from India had the profound impact, so to speak, of uniting China politically. I mean, they were split down the middle, in a sense.
Slightly. No, I wouldn't go as far as saying that. That's not strictly true. What is true is that you have 3 religions competing for attention in China. There's Taoism, there is Confucianism, which is like more of philosophy, in the same way that Buddhism is often seen more as a philosophy than a strict religion. Yeah. And then there's Buddhism. Buddhism is the latecomer. Buddhism arrives with foreigners in the 1st century, and it grows. By the 4th or 5th century, you've got a great deal of Buddhists at court, but they're not the dominant faction. And I think many Indians at school learn in their school textbooks about Xuanzang, the Chinese monk. And they learn about how Xuanzang came to the great university monastery of Nalanda, how he was bedazzled by all the learning of Nalanda. Again, Bihar being the center of scholarship in his view. And not just him, but Koreans, Japanese, Buddhists from Indonesia come all this way to learn at Nalanda. And when he gets back, he has brought with him, from the 20 years he spent working in Nalanda, copying out the Buddhist, Vedic, mathematical, astronomical text that he sees there, enough text to fill an entire pagoda called the Wild Goose Pagoda that still stands in Chang'an. And he allies with this young woman he's this old monk of 67. And there's this young woman in the harem who's only 15 years old called Wu Zetian. And Wu is a story that's very well known in China because she's been the subject of something like a 250-part soap opera, what the Mahabharata was to India in the 1980s. Remember everyone stopping to go and watch that Doordarshan
Ramayana
series.
and the Mahabharata.
Exactly. So Wu is this character, and she basically uses she's incredibly beautiful. She manages to frame the empress and the chief concubine, accuses them of murdering her baby. They are pushed out of the way. She becomes the empress. Then the emperor has a series of mysterious strokes. She comes in as the advisor. And finally, when he dies, she uses her sort of think tank of Nalanda-trained Mahayana Buddhist monks to effect what's effectively an Indian, or certainly a Buddhist, coup d'etat at the heart of the Chinese state.
Yeah, there's an Indian coterie around, and they're running effectively.
They're running Shanghai.
China. Yeah, or, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't last long. It's one 40-year period that's considered by the Chinese to be a terrible anomaly. And the Buddhist monks are fairly ruthless about producing sort of bogus prophecies that she's the reincarnation of Maitreya, that she's prophesied a Devi in the Lotus and the Diamond Sutra, and so on and so forth. But for a period of about 40 years, a bunch of Nalanda-trained Buddhist monks are absolutely in key positions. A guy called Gautam Siddhartha is running the Royal Astronomy. You've got a whole lot of very familiar sort of Kayas names operating at the heart of the Chinese state. And so far from China being the dominant force that we've all been sort of led to believe, the center of the Silk Road, the main center of East and West, China is, of course, incredibly important, incredibly rich.
Puppeteered by a bunch of
Indian... But a bunch of Biharis have taken it over.
Wonderful. That's just a great insight. I mean, that was eye-opening. Now,
I should say that this is... anyone that wants to learn more about this, there's a fantastic Indian scholar who's worked on this called Tansen Sen. Right. And I base my work very strongly on his work.
Yes, I saw a lot of your footnotes were crediting him repeatedly.
He's someone that has worked on this for many years and deserves full acknowledgement for. This is his discovery, not mine.
Well, that's great. That's good to know. That's great to know. Through the eyes of Xuanzang, you tell the story of the evolution of New Hinduism and the marginalization of Buddhism around 400 CE. Now, what impact did this transition have?
So you get this odd thing whereby Buddhism, which had been so dominant in India since the time of Ashoka, 250 BC, by the time of Xuanzang, which is 850 years later, in 600 AD, Buddhism is in decline. It's too abstract. Hinduism is sexier, really. You get to meet a god. You have darshan directly with a god. The god is present while the Buddha's enlightened, so he can't come and help you because he's already out of this world. He's extinguished. And there's just a sense which Hinduism's got all the tricks at this period. And there's a huge Hindu revival, which is well known. The Guptas are part of that story. And so when Xuanzang comes, he's disappointed that when he goes to the Buddhist holy places, many of them are already in ruins, and that what he calls temples of idolaters are there. But it's important not to overemphasize the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, because many of the Buddhist monasteries that we're excavating in in Afghanistan, for example, have Durga temples attached to them.
That's
so
right.
it's not like they're at war with each other. There is competition. So you have to get that balance right between they're different and they're sometimes in competition, but they're also, you have Hindu kings patronizing Nalanda, you have, as I say, Hindu temples within Buddhist complexes, and many Buddhist deities and Hindu deities being worshipped by the faithful of different faiths. And people, I think, at that period, as today in parts of rural India, have far less sort of strong boundaries in their faith. They don't, just like you can find a Sufi shrine in Nizamuddin not far from here, where you'll find people of all religions praying together. The same seems to be true in this period.
So we've got about 10 more minutes, and I've got 3 more questions. So we're pretty much on schedule here. Somewhere around, I've probably got the date wrong, but around 400 CE, Indians pivoted to the far, far east. Rome kind of fell off India's radar.
Correct.
So what exactly happened there?
So this is a very important part of the story.
Yeah.
So think back to your literature classes. Anti-Cleopatra. Anti-Cleopatra defeated by Octavius Caesar. Cleopatra attaches an asp to her breast and commits suicide, as does Mark Antony. Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire, and for 500 years, there is this incredibly lucrative trade for India in luxury goods that don't cost a great deal for Indians to gather, like ivory, like pepper, but which Romans will pay an astronomical fortune to buy and import. And suddenly that stops. Rome falls, the Huns besiege Rome. Incidentally, Attila the Hun, as his ransom for Rome, asks for 10,000 pounds of Indian pepper, not silk from China. He wants pepper from India. And by the 5th century, the ports of Myos Hormuz and Berenike, which are the big Roman trading ports looking east to India, they've been abandoned. Also, there's now a war going on with Persia, so not only are the land routes closed, but there's actually a blockade that the Persian ships are trying to enforce and trying to stop Roman ships getting through. So, major economic crisis in India. All this easy gold, which has been pouring in for 400, 500 years, as long as anyone could remember, suddenly it's not there. So where do they look? They look to Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold, and Savarna Dvipa, the island of gold, which is probably Sarawak. In the Ramayana, Sugriva says to Hanuman, if you kick the dust of Savarna Dvipa, gold dust will fly up in the air. And the people driving this are these incredible Tamil merchant guilds. And they're often made to sound quite boring in old textbooks, but they sound absolutely Game of Thrones badasses. These guys have their own mercenary armies protecting them. They even have, my friend Anirudh Kanasetti tells me that they even have a corps of assassins who track down anyone who kills their members on trading expeditions.
Very Mossad.
Very Mossad, exactly. No exploding pages, I think, but whatever the 5th century AD equivalent was. And these guys pioneer a pivot in India's trading systems, from looking westwards to Rome to looking eastwards to Southeast Asia. Now, this isn't a new thing. I mean, there's been Indian traders we know dealing with Southeast Asia since deepest antiquity. Little beads and things are turning up 2,000 or 3,000 BC. But in the 5th century, there's a massive increase in this. And we start getting, for example, a Tamil gold merchant's touchstone turning up in the narrowest part of the Kra Peninsula between Malaysia and Thailand. We get little settlements founded, rather like the East India Company do in India. You get the equivalent with the Tamil trading guilds setting up stuff in near what's now Penang in the Kedah Valley. And all over Southeast Asia, these river ports, particularly in the Mekong Delta, are now really springing to life. Their plans are often based on Indic city plans. And very early on, we get wooden Buddhas, and then Shiva Lingams, and then little Vaishnav statues, and finally we get huge temples and large sculptures by the 7th, 8th centuries. And a lot of this is clearly influenced specifically by the Pallava dynasty of Tamil Nadu. Mahendra Pallava, who built, everyone knows Mahabalipuram or Mamallapuram on the coast south of Chennai. Those guys who built those, the ruts on the beach in Mamallapuram, they are pioneering this trading routes out of Nagapattinam, out of Mamallapuram. And you find that the Pallava script, which is a version of Brahmi, which gets redesigned for the south in Kanchipuram, those round southern letters that we still have today, they're because everything is done in palm leaf in the south. And if you do the straight lines of North Indian script, you rip the palm leaf. So these curved linear scripts that you can write on palm are exported to Southeast Asia. And the Pallava Grantha script, which is the South Indian Brahmi, becomes the basis for every pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia. Pew, Khmer, Thai, Mon, and so on. All these different scripts. And you have images of large numbers of Brahmins taking advantage of this. They've been administering the courts of South India. They now sail over the seas, and they're busy administering the courts of Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia and particularly Indonesia. And these guys are welcomed. They're given wives, they're given estates, they're given huge privileges and riches. In return, they bring numeracy, literacy, the Shilpa Shastras, the Natya Shastras, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and suddenly you get enormous sculptural programs. For example, the first images in stone as a complete cycle telling the story of the Ramayana from beginning to end is at Prambanan. It doesn't turn up for another 500 years, a full sculptural cycle in Hampi, in Vijayanagara later on, but it's there from about 900 in Prambanan near Yogyakarta in Java in Indonesia. And one of the extraordinary things that's a surprise is that because India remains a fractured area, today India's one state and Southeast Asia is divided into Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Yes. The opposite was true in this period, that you have a divided India and an enormous Khmer empire that incidentally is probably the largest Hindu empire that ever was, is actually in Cambodia.
Fantastic.
This whole world is transformed. And the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, obscure stories of minor Tamil ascetics that previously only known in Kanchipuram turn up in the outside of Siem Reap. And I have to say that I've rarely had such pleasure researching any book as the travels I did for this book, going to Angkor Wat, going around Indonesia, all these places just after COVID, and being the only person in Angkor Wat. And literally the only person, other than the director in Borobudur, because it was still closed. Like, they let me in. I had an introduction from someone. And I would urge anyone that's interested in this to look east, young man or young woman, and go and see these places, because there's so much that's familiar, and yet it's different.
Yes.
And that's an important part of the story too. It's not that they're just copying everything that's done in Pallava Kanchipuram. By the time it arrives in Southeast Asia, it's slightly different. So the shore temples at Mahabalipuram are built in a volcano called Gedong Songo. Almost the same temple, and yet it's not quite the same. It's got little changes. The images of Vishnu, for example, they put the face of the emperor on him. I've never seen that in India, where you have Rajaraja Chola with Lord Shiva, but you don't have Rajaraja Chola as Lord Shiva. You have no caste in Southeast Asia. You have everyone eating pork, and perhaps strangest of all for Indians who are used to what's happening in this country, there are in the royal temples female Brahmins officiating at the pujas. So, as Tagore nicely puts it when he visits Angkor Wat, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her.
It's very interesting. I need to end with a question. All of this, and we I don't think we addressed it in the way you've addressed it, 2 or 3 points. Why wasn't this story told? What happened to this story?
So I think several things. I mean, the first answer everyone here would give, of course, is British colonialism and the attitudes of Macaulay, that a single shelf of good English books is worth more than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. That is part of the story, no question. Yeah. And the fact that no one, we all know in Britain about Pythagoras and Archimedes, but no one knows about Aryabhata and Brahmagupta to this day, is part of that still. But there's other things too. The Chinese have been very good at telling the story. India's been less good at telling its rival story. I think the way that Xi Jinping has weaponized the Silk Road to create his Belt and Road. Yeah. There is this talk of an MECC, which was floated at the G20, but it's still pretty fragile embryo, this idea, and been put on the shelf because of the Gaza war. Yeah. There's also just the fact that it's just ended up in different departments. You don't have departments of sort of Indian studies. You have Sanskrit departments, you have Pali departments.
Well, you do make a reference to, and I can't quite remember the phrase, but the Marxist orientation that seemed to sort of flinch at looking back at a Indic past.
So I don't know
fearing
that, I don't know that
Hindu
that's true,
revival of some
but
sort.
What is certainly true is that Marxist history is less interested in culture than it is in economics. And the sort of history we've had out of Indian universities until very recently has been very strongly, because of the Marxist leaning, which is a statement of fact, I don't think anyone would dispute that was the case, that it meant that it was de-peopled. There's very little interest in biography in Marxist history, so it's often a history that studies social forces and economic forces, not individuals and personalities. And my history is very much a history driven by biography and personality. But there's also, I think, the fact that there's also, I think, a matter of scholarly fashion. And in the 1930s, great Indian historians like R.C. Majumdar were talking about Hindu colonies in Southeast Asia. And that was actually wrong. These were not Hindu colonies. It's something more extraordinary. It was Indian ideas passing, an empire of the spirit, an empire of ideas. It was not an empire of the sword. You didn't have...
The soft power.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are famous Chola raids in 1016 and 1025, but that's late in the story. For most of this period, it's merchants and missionaries and Brahmins and thinkers passing their ideas on, and other people taking them on out of the sheer attractiveness and sophistication. The fact that the Mahabharata is such an extraordinary, fantastic, rollicking story. Everyone wants to hear it. Yeah. Ditto the Ramayana. And so there was a pushback in the post-colonial period with these newly decolonized countries like Indonesia. Didn't like to be told that they were savages who'd been colonized by brave Kshatriyas from Bihar. They wanted a different story. And so there's a lot of pushback at the overstatement of this Indianization. And I think partly because the Marxists were not so interested in religion and not so interested in culture, there was a sense that they didn't push back against the pushback, if you like. Which means that,
you saw your opportunity.
It's possible.
We've got how should I put this? You've got a centrist Scot, honorary Indian, who's talked to all the departments and basically brought them all together into this fantastic
I have to say, my
jewel.
brothers read this, and they thought it was all a bit obscure, and I've been so bowled over by I wasn't expecting this to be the hit that it's been, or the bestseller. I thought this was going to be a book, a niche book that would appeal to a few scholars, but it's turned out to be #1 bestseller ever since day one, so I'm very pleased.
Well, as I said, you've clearly put your finger on the pulse. This is now, and this is in India under Modi, the last 10 years, who's been wanting to sort of decolonize our view of history, perhaps.
Well, I wouldn't say this. That was not what inspired this book, and that's not the message I'm trying to put out. But it is an extraordinary story here that hasn't been told.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it's so much in the zeitgeist. Everyone's talking about this, Indic India, that you sort of have come in at the right time. That's exactly what I meant. Well, thank you, William. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful.